This is North Korea's bubble in Japan. It's a community of about 150,000 Koreans. Holdovers from the 1940s when Japan's military forcibly brought over their relatives. They run a network of schools where they teach their kids about Korean history, teach them Korean language. They teach them the ideology of the great leader Kim Il-sung. The guards are here this morning because 3 days ago, North Korea tested a bunch of missiles that landed right off Japan's shores. Before the students can leave, they have to change out of their traditional Korean clothing.
危ないというか、ちょっと視線が怖いので、学校に来てそれに着替えて。
But this community isn't giving in to the pressure. Their schools are the place where they can protect their identity and quietly revere their great leader and the homeland that he founded, a place none of them have ever lived. This North Korean bubble is a nation within a nation, whose borders are made out of culture, language, history, and ideology. And it shows how borders exist as much in our minds as they do on maps. In 1910, the Korean peninsula was annexed by Japan's expanding empire. During its rule, the empire brought tens of thousands of Koreans to Japan, mainly to work and to serve in their army, or in the case of Korean women, to serve as sex slaves in brothels for Japanese soldiers. Japan's empire grew until 1945, when World War II brought its sudden defeat and the loss of much of its empire, including Korea. The Koreans who were in Japan were free, but they found themselves in a country that didn't recognize them as citizens. The United States and the Soviet Union quickly filled the power vacuum of this newly liberated Korean peninsula, and two new countries were formed, the US backing the new South Korea and the Soviet Union backing the North, installing a rising leader, Kim Il-sung, who a few years later invaded the US-backed South, starting the Korean War. Most of the Koreans in Japan went back to Korea, but about 600,000 decided to stay in Japan. The Korean War changed everything, creating a bitter division between these two new Koreas. So the Koreans in Japan could no longer just be Korean. They suddenly had to choose which Korea they affiliated with. Almost all of them had originally been from what was now South Korea, but this new North Korea began paying special attention to the Koreans in Japan, sending them money and helping them build schools and businesses, effectively helping them build a cultural border to help protect their identity and language against a Japanese society that sought to change or destroy it.
そのような中で我々に手を差し伸べてくれたのが朝鮮民主主義人民共和国でした。
This school where the graduation is taking place was built with funding from Kim Il-sung in those early days after the war. For these stateless Koreans in Japan, this support from a faraway government built trust and loyalty to a regime that they had never actually lived under.
だから自分たちがここに今存在できるっていうのは、当時のそのキム・イルソン総書記もそうですし、金正恩総書記のその方針、だから自分の朝鮮人としての生を与えてくれた方だって言えると思います。
The North Korean-backed organization in Japan called themselves the Chongryeon, and over the following decades they built a network of schools, banks, and gambling parlors. They became rich and started sending millions of dollars back to North Korea to support the regime. In their heyday, the Chongryeon was worth around $25 billion. But something happened that would mark the beginning of the end for this North Korean business empire in Japan. In the late 70s, North Korea started sending spies disguised as fishermen to Japanese beaches to start kidnapping Japanese citizens. They brought them back to North Korea so that they could use them for their language and cultural understanding of Japan, so they could help train their spies. The victims, including a 13-year-old girl who allegedly died in captivity, gripped the nation's attention for years, their stories making their way into pop culture, their faces known to every citizen. Around the same time, North Korea began developing its long-range missile program, a program that would eventually lead North Korea to having nuclear weapon delivery capabilities. Both the nuclear and abduction issues came to a head in the early 2000s when North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, a treaty that prevents countries from building more nuclear weapons. The regime also officially admitted that they were behind some of the kidnappings of Japanese citizens. This set off a wave of violent attacks and hate speech against North Koreans living in Japan. Japanese government demanded that the Chongryon repay its outstanding debts. When the organization couldn't do this, they were forced to declare bankruptcy. Many of their buildings, including their headquarters, were seized. The organization was left in financial ruin, with only its network of a few dozen schools standing. These schools became the next target for Japanese animosity towards North Korea. Korean students suddenly found themselves in the middle of this heated international conflict.
この教育問題、子どもの問題に政治を絡ませて、あたかも子どもたちを人質にとって外交をするような。
This graph shows the amount of state funding for Korean schools by Japanese prefectures over time. 2006 was the year that North Korea tested a nuclear weapon, and you can see the immediate drop-off of funding every year thereafter. Prefectures providing tuition subsidies for Korean schools went from 28 in 2006 down to 12 today. Education officials specifically cite the abduction issue as well as the general situation in North Korea as their motive for defunding the schools.
十分に払えないでいます。上げていません。上げれていません。はい。本当に月に半分上げれたらいい方です。
Japan's Ministry of Education declined my request for an interview on this. The UN and other international bodies have repeatedly condemned the Japanese structural discrimination against Koreans. The North Korean community often cites this as validation for their plight. But the UN has also called North Korea's human rights violations so grave that they have no parallel in the contemporary world. When you ask them how they reconcile this contradiction, the response is always some version of
Any country has human rights issues.
アメリカの人権、日本の人権問題はどうなってるのかと、そっちもそれ以上に深刻な問題はたくさんあると思います。そこにイチャモンつけてるぐらいだったら、先に自分の。
At first, I found this astounding, that there could be such a willful ignorance to the atrocities of the North Korean regime. But the more embedded I got into this North Korean community in Japan, the more I realized that to this marginalized community, North Korea represents more of a refuge of safety for their identity, something they crave while they're living in a country that is actively working to diminish their heritage and culture.
I 私は日本で生まれましたから、祖国というのは話と映画とそういうのしか見てなかったんですね。初めてね、祖国の地に足をつけた時は本当に感動しましたね。
While younger generations are more likely to assimilate into Japanese society, the Chongryon have done an exceptional job at cultivating a strong Korean identity, despite all the pressure and hardship. In their last year of high school, the students have an opportunity to go visit North Korea. Seeing and hearing the accounts of this highly choreographed visit to Pyongyang is all you need to understand the relationship that this disenfranchised community has towards its adopted homeland.
言葉では表せないような気持ちになりました。
なんか最後別れる時とかもうみんな号泣してみたいな。
I visited the North Korean university where they've curated a museum dedicated to everything Korean. Every rock, tree, species of fish, plant, animal, root that has ever existed on the Korean peninsula is found in this museum, which was built with support from the North Korean government. I had never seen such a meticulously comprehensive collection to enshrine a place and a history. This place does not exist for visitors. It's much more of a statement that, in spite of intense pressure and hostility, Korean culture endures in Japan.
朝鮮人民元は祖国の方で、総連を大事にしているという意味もあるし、青少年学生たちに祖国をもっと身近に感じてほしいという願いから来ているわけです。
North Korea isn't their home country in the way that you would think. They weren't born there. They've never lived there. But they see it as their home country because the country that they were born in actively works to make their lives harder. Like in many parts of the world, right-wing nationalism is surging in Japan. Anti-Korean rallies are on the rise, according to an investigation by Japanese law enforcement. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is a fierce nationalist, and he's caught up in a scandal right now for having given secret donations to an ultra-nationalist kindergarten with anti-Korean views. Japanese nationalism leads to discrimination against Koreans. This causes the Koreans to resist Japan as their home country, looking to a country they've never lived in for support and protection of their identity. Affiliating with this universally reviled regime that routinely vows to destroy Japan creates more resentment from the Japanese population and politicians, leading to more discrimination, which leads to, again, deeper commitment to North Korea as a protector. And in my mind, there's no doubt that the cycle will continue.
人間は朝鮮人として生まれたから朝鮮人になるんではないですよね、そういう関係性の中で朝鮮人が育っていく。それはここしかない。だからここがとっても大切なんだと。我々にとってはどんなに大変でもここを守りたい。それがまた生きがいですよね。